Like what kinds of scale might there be? Yeah, relative size. Very good. And you guys, in engineering or geometry, you understand you kind of take something this big and make it bigger by basically adjusting each size accordingly by the same amount, right? So a small triangle can become a big triangle if you adjust each angle the same amount. So with math, it's pretty self-explanatory, but of course with art, we're talking about kind of meaningfulness. So, when you think about scale, generally, we're going to talk about four different kinds of scales. We're going to talk about miniature, which is kind of the rarest, not necessarily completely rare, but definitely a little more rare when it comes to sculpture, depending. You've got human scale, you've got monumental scale, and high. I'm just adding you to attendance, high. And you've got monument hierarchical scale. And we talked briefly about hierarchical scale when we looked at the statue of Caesar Augustus. So you usually need some kind of reference unless you're there in person to see it. So for instance, something like this, what scale do you think this sculpture is? And don't get, and I point that out because it's hard to tell because you need a reference point, right? So what might you expect the scale of this sculpture to be that we see here? Human, miniature, or monumental? Does it look miniature, do you think?
I'd expect a roughly human size.
Yeah, that's what, and I can't say that's for sure the case because, of course, you need some kind of physical reference. So often with scale, you use the human body as a kind of reference point, either showing someone in the background or something recognizable, like a doorway or any kind of object that's whose size is universally recognizable, right? So in this case, it's hard to tell because there's nothing really recognizable, though I think we can probably infer that this subject is not a monument. It could be, right? But I think it's probably human scale. And, think about the value of, why you might make something human scale versus miniature versus monumental. Well, in the broadest terms, something monumental is usually public, right? Something outdoors out and for public view. So the Statue of Liberty would not be good if it was a miniature, right? It would be very hard to see the Statue of Liberty if she was a miniature. So, that's pretty common sense to think anything you want visible should be very big, right? So why might you make something miniature? Well, maybe because you want to transport it with you, maybe because it's a personal object and it's no longer a public object. So a good example of that might be a doll. Although I don't know if we consider a doll artwork, it's still a good example of something you might use as a personal object, maybe for veneration, maybe just like a little companion, like for kids, but certainly not something you would necessarily display in public because you'd want to make it much bigger so it's more visible, right? And of course, and there's always exceptions, right? There's no absolutes in art, but just in general terms, when would you use human scale? When might you use human scale? What would be the logic for wanting a sculpture to be, 1-to-1 human scale? And I think someone said, yeah, to be accurate, perhaps, to make someone look just the way they did, for instance. Maybe you don't, yeah, to fit inside a building, very good. You can't fit the Statue of Liberty inside of a building, right? And to make them kind of more real and maybe material costs, this is good. Everyone's considering a lot of different things, right? So certainly you don't want, maybe human scale is for indoor purposes. Human scale might be so you have a 1-to-1 relationship, right? When something's huge like the Statue of Liberty, it's really her and everyone, right? It's not a 1-to-1. Miniature is also maybe something that's 1-to-1 because you maybe hold in your pocket. It's all about your own personal, intimate relationship. But human scale is kind of like a few of you said, like to bring someone back to life the same size they were. Maybe you want to. I think making a president, for example, I would assume it's less likely that someone would make a president monumental scale because we tend to think as presidents, even though they're the top of the hierarchy, they're still one of us, right? So you wouldn't want to make a president too big unless it's maybe Mount Rushmore, which is kind of a little different. But certainly you can understand the logic of human scale where you want someone to feel like real and not kind of too big, not superhuman, right? You want them to be kind of the real person still. Now, of course, if you want it to be more visible in public, you can, play around with scale. But just in general terms, all I want you to do is think about the why you might pick one versus the other. And we'll look at some examples now. Is this, by the way, is this one we're looking at here? Is this a good example of naturalism? This seated scribe from Egypt? Does it feel like it's based on observation? And someone says, yes, yeah. So this is a wonderful example of naturalism. And I just want to point this out to show, yeah, the Egyptians were really, way more sophisticated than the Greeks in so many ways. It's just the Greeks ran with naturalism as their main sort of thing, whereas Egyptian kind of had a whole range of, yes, I'll use naturalism here, or no, I won't here. And the Greeks really borrowed from a lot of that, those thousands of years of Egyptian heritage. And so, Egypt really, from painting to architecture to sculpture, they really had it all very mastered by the time the Hellenistic period rolls around. But of course, one thing with Egypt is they were more self-contained. They didn't want to, conquer too far beyond their borders. So, there's definitely kind of a trade-off. So next week, we're going to be talking more about Rome, ancient Rome, and architecture. But proportion and scale aren't too far from that subject, especially when you think about the house of God, putting God into a building, and that's when you have to think about, well, how big do you want your God or your goddess, and why would you make a God human scale or a goddess monumental scale or miniature. So let's get back to that now, and maybe think about comic books, like translating a comic book to a movie, or translating a comic book to animation. Wonder Woman as sort of animated Wonder Woman, real Wonder Woman. It's pretty kind of straightforward. Seems like a pretty straightforward one-to-one. But of course, with different comic book characters, it's a little trickier, right? This is my generation's Incredible Hulk. This is Lou Ferrigno, the wrestler. And it doesn't quite work because, of course, Incredible Hulk is all about this massive size that grows according to how angry he gets, right? So, I'm sure for a lot of you, if you watch the Incredible Hulk here on the right, you're gonna giggle, because it's just it's hard to translate to this sort of superhuman scale, the Incredible Hulk on the right, because they're limited by technology and whatnot. I mean, they do a pretty good job. I liked watching the show when I was growing up. He always said, "Don't make me angry." And Black Panther, right? That's another kind of one-to-one. Of course, when you look at proportions and musculature, they're going to exaggerate muscles to make them more of that kind of heroic ideal that we saw with Greeks. But of course, no nudity in comic books. It's kid-friendly material. You're often, well, depending on the comic books, because they often do kind of sexualize a lot of the subjects, but within kind of PG 13, PG kind of range. And translating Black Panther to reality, I think, is pretty one-to-one. A lot of costumes now have the big bulky muscles like a Homelander has, and the boys, and you don't have to necessarily work out. You can just have that foam, whatever. And maybe one day someone will learn to just bring that into the everyday life, and no one has to go to the gym anymore. But comic books, I think, are an interesting case of kind of bringing a subject to life in real form in film that we've seen in the last 20 years, and really using all the special effects to, I think, fully realize that character. Because before, the movies until Superman 1, and even that was really hard, showing someone flying and having to bring Superman to life believably without people thinking, okay, the flying looks wonky or everything looks wonky. I mean, even Superman, Christopher Reeve, his movement while he's flying really sold the idea that he's flying, because he understood from his experience as a pilot, as a glider, flying gliders, that you really have to sell it. So it's not just the physical appearance that's accurate, but the movement especially, that has to be convincing. So miniature scale, human scale, monumental scale, and architect and hierarchical scale. And we'll talk about all those now. And that's definitely kind of one step away from naturalism, but kind of within the kind of idea of observation and accuracy. So something like this is miniature, I think, compared to, it's not human scale. And I think because it's meant to be carried around with you. So often miniature means a private experience with the art. It's something you own. It's not public. It's not something you put on a monument or on a pedestal in public. It's something you hold in your own hand and keep in your own possession. Dolls, likewise, it's a very personal kind of miniature thing that is all about childhood in this case. But of course, there's interesting rules that still apply, like you don't sexualize Barbie dolls, for instance, right? That's why you get this really wonky kind of anatomy on dolls, but it would be wrong if you had nipples or genitalia on Barbie because you've completely missed the point of a doll, which I think is really more like kids combing the hair of the doll, pretending to be mom or dad, and it's not really anything you would ever want to add too many details to. And of course, she's not even accurate, right? She's fall over if this was real. So this is an example of completely disregarding accurate proportions, but because the whole point of this is not accuracy, but rather to give a kid some object they can play with and kind of act out adulthood or whatever. So I think you guys get the idea that dolls are really kind of this personalized, intimate thing. But the same rules apply for something like this. This is Aphrodite. This is a sculpture at the Tampa Museum. And this, you notice she has no nipples, right? And I think the idea here is you want to have your cake and eat it too. You want to sensualize Aphrodite, but you don't want to make it too sexual because one, it feels awkward, especially in public, to kind of see these kind of details. And you want to, the whole point is not erotic. I mean, there's a sensual, it definitely is veering towards erotic, but it's still kind of in its lane. It stays well within, it stays within the bounds of kind of PG-13 and rather than R-rated. So they're kind of pushing that envelope with very sensual things like the belly button, the silk dipping in the belly button, one kind of shoulder revealing itself and dipping down and showing the breast, but not showing the nipple, I think keeps it kind of within that kind of realm of it's not too awkward or too sexualized. Of course, I think some of us might say it's still very sexual and sensual, but it certainly avoids crossing that line. And I think it might be an arbitrary line for some people, but still, nevertheless, I think we can kind of relate to that idea that you don't want to overemphasize the sexual elements because if you do, it goes from being a sort of symbolic or story to being like erotic. And art generally, not absolutely, but generally steers away from the erotic for different reasons, including it's a public work of art. So, usually sexuality is something very private and personal, not always, but in sculpture, often you kind of steer away from things that are too sexual. So often male genitalia will be shrunken on sculptures, and you won't necessarily see nipples, and you don't really sexualize. Sculpture is not a form of eroticism that I mean, of course you could find anything erotic if you want to, but the premise here is not to kind of look at Hercules and be like, oh, this is a nude guy, you're not supposed to lust after him, but really it humanizes him by having all the parts that we all recognize, right? It makes him more human. So when it comes to different scales, you can see here on the left, this guy. And I think earlier I might have told you guys that the statue of Caesar Augustus was like, can't remember. By the way, if we do run out of time, I'll just send you guys another link to the meeting because unfortunately these meetings only last 40 minutes. But so on the left here, we've got Neptune, and you notice there's a little dolphin there. And that is an example of hierarchical scale. You're meant to be tricked into thinking that Neptune is much bigger than he actually is. In fact, if you go to the Tampa Museum, he's about my height. So about 5 something, very, very, very small guy, short guy. But it looks like he's much bigger because that dolphin makes you think the sculpture is a lot bigger. So that is an example of hierarchical scale where you're sort of using illusion to make you think that something is much bigger than it actually is. Here, an Egyptian sculpture. Now, tell me, what scale is this sculpture here? Using the chat function here, and it says, yes, monumental. So I think we kind of understand you need a human being to indicate to us how big something is. So that always helps. And yes, monumental, very good. So I think it's pretty common sense. I knew you guys would kind of know this very well. On the left, this sculpture is at the Tampa Museum. That's Venus. And you might notice they've actually taken the original Venus on the right, and the artist, she recomposed her by adding the missing elements according to how she imagined the original might have looked. And certainly the result is monumental. And maybe a comment on plastic surgery. I don't know, maybe can you restore beauty to its original? I kind of like the one on the right a little more because I just like the mystery. But, she feels very welcoming and relaxed and self-confident. And I think that's the idea that even though Venus is semi-nude, she's very at ease with herself. And I think that's the real connection you have to her, that she feels welcoming and kind of comfortable in her own skin. And now we get to Caesar Augustus, who's actually about 6 feet 10, 7 feet tall. So for me, when I see this, I think he's huge. It's like Statue of Liberty scale, or not that big, but somewhere between human scale and Statue of Liberty. But in fact, he's just over maybe human scale. And this is another example of hierarchical scale where that little Cupid Eros figure is a divine connection to Venus, and also meant to make Caesar look much bigger than he actually is.
To be fair,
What's
I
that?
just want to add, I wanted to say, to be fair, considering the fact that the statue is 6'10", uh, it the baby being there and at that scale isn't too far out of place.
Yeah, it's not. It's the baby should be what, a little taller, right?
Actually, I like it depends on the
Okay.
age, really,
Yeah,
because it looks like newly born. So
yeah. So like a baby's even smaller, right? Yeah. So
yeah,
I think the idea here is from a distance, you're sort of like meant to be thinking much bigger than he actually is. But it really kind of depends on the sculpture. I think in this case, the more overarching thing is to just kind of tell a story and connect him to Venus. I also would point out from a structural point of view, marble is prone to breaking, right? As you can see from other examples, like breaks, the arms are and the head is the first thing to break. So having a little sidekick that reinforces that one leg prevents Caesar from, breaking his leg and falling down. So there's a sort of engineering aspect to having a little sidekick next to him. But remember, the bare feet is really cool. He's kind of giving you the signal, leading people to battle. And next week, when we look at Rome, we're going to look at this evolution from extreme naturalism, like you see on the left, to a more kind of symbolic use of the body, which we see a Constantine on the right. So within the Roman Empire, or during the span of the Roman Empire, from maybe around the time of Caesar Augustus, around 0 AD, all the way to Constantine in about 325 AD, Rome goes from this very Greek-inspired, Egyptian-inspired naturalism to a more symbolic use of the body. And so we get away from naturalism and we go more towards a kind of, I don't want to say cartoony, but less accurate. So what about Constantine on the right feels less accurate?
the eyes.
Yeah, and why? So, I'm sure they could have made the eyes the actual size. Very good. I see you have to say that too, Matt and Kiernan. So, why make the eyes so big? What's the value of making Constantine's eyes bigger than they actually are?
To know where he's looking.
Okay, maybe to just emphasize what he's looking at. And of course, he's looking up at heaven, you might say, right? And you might think of like what makes a god, right? Immortality, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. So, having the eyes enlarged kind of also implies like he's got greater view, like he's close, he can see beyond a normal being. So, the term big mouth means someone who talks a lot, right? So, having big eyes might, in this case, be a metaphor for his kind of being able to see beyond what normal people can see. So, it's still within the realm of naturalism, but they're pushing the envelope because, as we'll see, when Rome shifts from pagan believing in many gods to Christianity believing in one God, then you also have a shift in artwork corresponding to that shift towards a more spiritual realm. So basically, we go from this very grounded earthly realm based on material power, which is really what you see with Caesar here, like material power, to a spiritual emphasis by the time of conversion by Constantine in 300. And for the next several hundred, many, in fact, a millennia after that, we're going to see that Christianity really emphasizes that sort of spiritual aspect of sculpture and painting. So things go from being very naturalistic in the time of Caesar to becoming more like floating in the air and floating in heaven, floating up on the ceiling of the church, well into the medieval period. And that only, the pendulum starts swinging back the other way by the time we get to the Renaissance, when the artists like Michelangelo and others are feel like they have permission to affirm the ancient roots of Rome. And we'll talk about why that is when we get to that subject. But certainly next week, we'll see that evolution from very naturalistic to less naturalistic by the time Constantine. Of course, scale doesn't necessarily fit into that. Like scale kind of has you have reasons for scale that kind of supersede or are beyond the sort of more specific things like I just talked about with spiritual emphasis or material emphasis. Like this, of course, is an example of monumental scale. And now some more examples of hierarchical scale, because that might be a little tricky. Who you show dominance by making one person bigger than the other, right? This is a very famous Egyptian way to I can't remember the name of it, but basically commemorates the defeat, I think, of Upper Egypt defeating Lower Egypt, the Nubian side. And here the gods are much bigger than the mortals. So pretty, I think, self-explanatory hierarchical scale. Now we'll see this next week. And this is a very interesting example of scale because either the human beings are really big or the cattle and the sheep are shrunk into smaller size. But the idea is, remember, we've seen nature as a sort of adversary to humanity or maybe something we have to overcome. Well, here you see nature reduced to this tiny little sidekick. And that's because Rome at this point has conquered, conquered nature for all intents and purposes, dominated nature by domesticating all kinds of animals from the auroch to the rabbit to other things. So this is really a work of sculpture that shows Rome being prosperous by dominating sort of nature and taking control of agriculture. And it does also look a lot like the Virgin Mary with Jesus on her lap. And in fact, we're looking at Rome, probably Romulus and Remus kind of, but we'll talk about them next week when we get to that. So what about here? What kind of scale is this? Well, in fact, this is hierarchical scale, but within the body, kind of shrinking the body to emphasize the head or the other way around. So you can certainly use hierarchical scale and you could say even this picture of Constantine, you could say it's hierarchical scale because the eyes are intentionally made bigger. So it's really about relationships between either you and something else or within your body, emphasizing one part because that's sort of just part of your culture. So there are all kinds of different forms of scale or hierarchical scale. And what about this? Is monumental, human, or miniature? I think everyone knows that pretty well. We'll call that yes, very good. We'll call that a rhetorical question. And monumental matchsticks, right? Now, why make matchsticks monumental? But because I think that's the humor value of taking something that's very tiny and making it this big. Is there's something fun about that. Now, what about here? Well, you need to see a little more in order to fully see it. And you know what? It looks like we're going to run out of time. So let me go ahead and stop this and let me send you another link so we can have a little more time. So just open your email and open up the link, and maybe I'll figure out a way to make our classes longer so we don't